The night was ink black, the kind of dark that swallowed headlights whole and made the world outside the windshield feel like a half-remembered dream. I'd been driving for hours, picking up tired passengers from late shifts, bars, or nowhere they cared to explain. My rideshare app had been pinging non-stop, but the streets were eerily empty. It was past 2 a.m., the hour when exhaustion starts to creep into your bones, but I kept going. The fares were good tonight. That's when the request came in. A single word now, no address, just a pin dropped on the map a few blocks away. I almost ignored it. Riders like that could be trouble, the kind who might try to hustle you for a free ride or worse. But something about the location on the app gave me pause. It was near an overpass I didn't remember well, a stretch of road with no houses or businesses nearby. Just dead grass, rusted guardrails, and the soft hum of cars overhead. I clicked accept without really thinking, like my thumb acted on its own. When I pulled up, I didn't see anyone at first. My headlights illuminated the cracked asphalt and a broken fence leaning into the ditch. I was about to cancel the trip when I noticed her. She came into view from the side of the car, moving with the sort of urgency that made me instinctively reach for the lock button. Her silhouette was sharp and jerky, almost like she was trying to run but couldn't quite manage the rhythm. She yanked the back door open and slid inside, her movements quick and clipped like she was escaping something. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She didn't answer right away, just slammed the door shut and sat back, breathing heavily. Her face was pale, almost too pale, and her eyes darted back and forth, as though scanning the darkness outside. She had dark hair that fell in tangled waves around her face, damp and clinging to her skin like she'd been running through rain that I hadn't noticed. Her clothes were strange layered, mismatched, and rumpled, like she'd grabbed whatever was closest without caring if it made sense. "Just drive," she said finally, her voice low and flat. I hesitated, fingers hovering over my phone. I need a destination to start the ride. Her head snapped toward me so fast that I flinched. "Just drive," she said, louder this time, her voice edged with something between desperation and fury. I turned the wheel, pulling onto the main road, telling myself I could always kick her out if this went sideways. But the way she was sitting, hunched forward and gripping the seatbelt, made my gut churn with unease. Something wasn't right. She didn't give me directions, didn't even look at her phone. Instead, she kept craning her neck to look out the rear window, her eyes wide and fixed on something I couldn't see. Occasionally she muttered to herself, words so soft I couldn't catch them. I tried not to watch her too much in the mirror, but every time I glanced back, I saw her lips moving, her hands clutching her knees like she was trying to keep herself from flying apart. "Is someone following you?" I asked, breaking the silence. Her head whipped toward me again, and for a second I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she nodded, just once, quick and sharp. Who? I pressed, but she didn't respond. Instead, her breathing picked up, her shoulders rising and falling as she stared out the back window again. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I tried to focus on the road, but every so often, I caught her reflection in the mirror, her face tense and drawn, her lips still moving. "I can't outrun someone if I don't know where we're going," I said, my voice steady but firm. "If you don't tell me, I'll have to pull over." "Don't stop," she hissed, her voice cutting through the car like a blade. "Don't ever stop. He'll catch up if you stop." That's when I felt it, a shift in the air, subtle but heavy, like the pressure inside the car had changed. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, but this time I didn't just see her. Something flickered in the shadows beyond the glass, just at the edge of the red taillights, something that made my stomach clench. A dark shape, formless but heavy, like smoke coiling into the faint outline of a figure. It was only there for a second, then gone, but I knew I'd seen it. "What the hell?" I murmured, gripping the wheel tighter. She turned to me, her expression stark and wild. "You saw him, didn't you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried weight, a certainty that rooted me to the spot. "You saw him?" I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I pressed the gas pedal a little harder, the engine whining as we sped up. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pressing in from behind, just out of sight. "Who is he?" I asked after a long silence, my voice lower this time, careful. She didn't look at me, just stared out the window, her fingers curling and uncurling against her thighs. "He doesn't have a name," she said finally, her voice so soft it was almost drowned out by the hum of the tires. Not one I could tell you anyway. He just picks people, follows them. He doesn't stop. What does he want? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. To stay close, she whispered, and something about the way she said it made the air feel colder. I glanced at the temperature gauge, but it hadn't budged. The chill was inside the car, wrapping around us like invisible fingers. She started muttering again, faster this time, her words tumbling over each other like water over rocks. I tried to catch them, but they didn't make sense, fragments of sentences, numbers, a name maybe, but nothing I could piece together. I kept driving, the road blurring under the headlights, the lines disappearing into the darkness like they were being swallowed. After what felt like forever, she said something that froze the blood in my veins. Don't look in the mirror. It was so sudden, so firm that I almost slammed on the brakes. What? Don't look, she repeated, her voice trembling now, thick with fear. He gets closer if you look. I couldn't help myself. My eyes darted to the mirror, just for a second, but it was enough. The figure was back, more distinct this time, a shadowy outline that seemed to pulse and shift as it clung to the edge of the light. It didn't have features, not exactly, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, fixed on the back of my head. The car lurched as I swerved slightly, pulling my eyes back to the road. She let out a small gasp, clutching the seatbelt. I told you not to look, she said, her voice breaking. You can't look, you'll make it worse. Worse, I snapped, my voice higher than I intended. What the hell does that mean? What the hell is going on? She didn't answer. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. I realized then that she wasn't scared for herself, not entirely. She was scared for me. I wanted to demand answers, to pull over and force her to explain, but I didn't dare stop. The road ahead stretched on endlessly, dark and desolate, but something in me knew stopping would be worse. The thing in the mirror, it was still there. I could feel it even when I didn't look. A pressure against my neck like cold fingers brushing the skin. The woman pressed her hands to her temples, rocking slightly in her seat. Her whispers grew frantic, words tumbling out in a stream of panic. He finds cracks, you know, little cracks in places, in people. He slips through, follows you forever, never lets go. What do you mean, cracks? I asked, my voice tight. What is he? Why is he following you? She didn't answer, just kept rocking and muttering, her eyes darting between the side windows and the mirror like she was expecting something to break through. The road felt impossibly long now, the dark stretching further than it should. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It hadn't changed. The time was frozen 2:47 a.m. That made no sense. I'd been driving for what felt like an hour. The silence between us grew heavy, punctuated only by her quiet murmurs and the faint hum of the tires on the pavement. I tried to focus on driving, to pretend this was just another weird passenger, but every so often I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. Something was pacing alongside the car, keeping perfect time with us, even as I sped up. My hands gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white. Don't stop, she said again, her voice breaking the quiet like a gunshot. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, don't stop the car. Lady, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, but I can't just keep driving forever. I need to know where we're going. She turned to me then, her eyes wide and desperate. It doesn't matter where. He's already here. A chill crawled up my spine. I didn't want to ask what she meant. I didn't need to. The car jolted suddenly as though something had slammed into the back bumper. My heart leapt into my throat, and I instinctively checked the mirror. The shadow was closer now, pressed against the glass like it was trying to seep into the car. It wasn't just a shape anymore. I could make out fingers, long and skeletal, clawing at the edge of the window. The woman screamed, a raw, guttural sound that filled the car and made my ears ring. Don't look. Drive faster. I stomped on the gas, the engine roaring in protest as we surged forward. The shadow seemed to stretch, elongating into something massive, its inky tendrils wrapping around the rear of the car. The air inside grew colder, my breath fogging the glass even though the heater was on full blast. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. My focus tunneled onto the road, the dark horizon that never seemed to get any closer. "What does he want?" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of my fear. "Why won't he stop?" Her voice was barely audible over the rising noise of the wind and the tires. "He wants you to look at him. That's how he gets in." Gets in where I demanded, but she didn't answer. Her eyes were glued to the back window, her lips moving in silent prayer or something like it. The car jolted again, harder this time, and I nearly lost control. The wheel jerked in my hands and the headlights swung wildly, illuminating the empty road ahead. Empty, but not for long. A figure appeared in the distance, standing dead center in the lane. It wasn't the shadow, it was a man, tall and still, his features obscured by the darkness. His head was tilted slightly to the side, as though he were listening to something I couldn't hear. The woman gasped, her nails digging into the upholstery. "Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop." "I can't just hit him," I yelled, but my hands refused to steer away. The man didn't move. As we barreled toward him, I realized he wasn't real, not in the way a person should be. His edges were blurred, his outline flickering like a bad signal on a TV screen. But his eyes, they were sharp, piercing, glowing faintly in the dark like distant headlights. At the last second, he stepped aside, vanishing into the darkness without a sound. I swerved anyway, narrowly avoiding the guardrail, and the woman screamed again, her voice raw and ragged. "He's trying to make you stop. Don't listen. Don't believe what you see." I didn't answer. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I felt like the car was suffocating me, the air thick and heavy with something I couldn't name. The mirror caught my eye again, and this time I couldn't look away. The shadow had changed. It wasn't outside the car anymore. It was sitting in the back seat. It loomed behind her, a hulking mass of black that seemed to devour the light. I couldn't see its face if it even had one, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The woman seemed unaware, her eyes fixed on the window, but I knew she felt it. Her body was trembling, her breath shallow and quick. "What do I do?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She turned to me then, her face pale and hollow, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's not about what you do," she said, her voice trembling. "It's about what you don't do. Don't stop, don't look too long. And whatever happens, don't let him take the wheel." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for the first time I realized what she meant. The shadow wasn't just following us. It wasn't just in the car. It was waiting for me to let my guard down, to slip up, to give it a chance. But I didn't know if I could hold out. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and I couldn't tell if I was escaping or being drawn deeper into something I didn't understand. The shadow loomed larger, its shape shifting as though it was alive, pulsing and twisting like smoke caught in a windstorm. It didn't stay still, writhing in place, and yet somehow it felt perfectly still, as if it was both moving and motionless at the same time. I forced myself to look away from the rearview mirror, focusing on the road ahead, but its presence was impossible to ignore. I could feel it behind me, a weight pressing against my senses, making my skin crawl. The woman's breathing quickened, and she started rocking again, clutching her head. "He's getting closer," she said through gritted teeth. "He's almost in." "What do you mean in?" I snapped, panic making my voice crack. "In where?" "The car? Me? What the hell are you talking about?" She didn't answer right away, her lips moving in silent prayer, or maybe it wasn't prayer at all. Her hands trembled as she gripped her knees. "You shouldn't have taken this ride," she said finally, her voice hollow. "I shouldn't have called you." My knuckles tightened on the wheel. "No kidding. What's going on? What is this thing? Why is it after you?" Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and for a moment I saw something in her gaze that wasn't fear. It was guilt. "It's not just after me," she whispered. "It's after anyone who sees it." My stomach dropped. "What?" Her voice grew quieter, the words falling from her lips like stones into a bottomless well. "He follows cracks, like I told you. People with cracks. You looked too long, didn't you?" I didn't answer, but the silence must have told her enough. Her head sank into her hands, and a sound escaped her lips, not a sob, but something deeper, heavier. "I tried to warn you. I tried to warn. The car lurched again, harder this time, like something had slammed into the back of it with inhuman force. The steering wheel jerked in my hands, and I fought to keep the car steady, swerving wildly across the lane. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced at the speedometer. 90 miles an hour. The tires screamed against the asphalt, but I didn't dare slow down. I risked a glance in the mirror again, unable to help myself. The shadow was no longer a formless mass. It was becoming something. The vague outline of a head, shoulders, long limbs, impossibly elongated fingers curling around the edges of the seat. Its body seemed to stretch endlessly, spilling into the floorboards like a liquid that absorbed every flicker of light. And its head. It was tilting, mimicking the motion of the man we'd seen on the road. The empty space where its eyes should have been bored into mine through the mirror, and for a moment I felt my grip on reality start to slip. My vision blurred, the edges of the road dissolving into a smear of light and shadow. I blinked hard, shaking my head to clear it. "Don't look," she screamed, slapping the back of the seat in front of her. "I told you, don't look." Her voice snapped me out of it, and I tore my gaze from the mirror, focusing on the road again. My hands shook as I adjusted my grip on the wheel, my breathing ragged. "What does it want?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Her eyes were glassy, her face pale as she stared straight ahead. "It wants to take everything." The words felt like a physical blow, and I struggled to process what she meant. The car jolted again, and this time I felt something cold brush against my shoulder. It wasn't her hand. I didn't dare turn my head, but the sensation lingered, icy tendrils crawling down my arm. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to scream. The dashboard lights flickered, and the radio crackled to life, spitting out static. Beneath the hissing noise, a faint voice began to speak low, guttural, almost like a growl. I couldn't make out the words, but they weren't meant for me. They were meant for it. Or maybe they were coming from it. The woman clutched her head tighter, her fingers digging into her scalp. "You have to keep going. Whatever happens, don't stop. He can't fully take you if the car keeps moving." "That's insane," I shouted, my voice shaking with panic. "We can't just keep driving forever. The gas." "Then he'll take you," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "If you stop, he'll get in. Fully in. And then you're gone, just like all the others." Her words hung in the air like poison, and I felt my mind racing, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. The road stretched on endlessly, no intersections, no turns, just an infinite strip of asphalt that shouldn't exist. The gas gauge hadn't moved in what felt like hours, stuck just above half a tank. Time itself seemed to have warped around us. The shadow in the back seat shifted, its form becoming more solid with every passing second. I could hear it now, a faint, wet sound, like the slithering of something alive. My peripheral vision caught the twitch of its limbs, the way its head tilted toward me, as though it were waiting for the right moment. "Drive faster," she yelled suddenly, her voice cracking. "He's car." The car slammed into something. A deafening thud reverberated through the vehicle, and the steering wheel wrenched out of my hands. We spun out of control, the tires screeching as the car skidded sideways. I fought to regain control, my heart pounding in my chest, but the car refused to obey. We came to a stop on the shoulder, the engine sputtering before falling silent. Silence. I stared at the dashboard, my hands trembling on the wheel. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, empty and desolate, but I could feel it. I didn't dare look in the mirror, but I knew the shadow was still there. "Why did you stop?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Something shifted behind me, a creak of the seat, a faint rustle of movement. The shadow was no longer waiting. It was here. The woman's breathing turned shallow and quick, and she pressed herself back against her seat, as if trying to melt into it. "It's over now," she whispered, her voice broken. "He's in." I shook my head violently, gripping the steering wheel like it was a lifeline. No, I can start the car again." "I can." "Don't turn around," she interrupted, her tone more desperate than ever. "Don't look at him, no matter what you hear. no matter what he does. The car was completely still, but the air was alive with an oppressive energy. It pressed against my temples, made my skin feel too tight for my body. I became hyper-aware of every sound: the faint ticking of the cooling engine, the whisper of wind outside, and the low, almost imperceptible noise coming from the back seat. It wasn't breathing exactly, but it had a rhythm, a sound that sent icy needles of dread straight through my core. I glanced down at the ignition, my hand hovering over the key. If I could just start the car, I could keep moving, keep it from solidifying fully. My fingers brushed the key, but something stopped me. It wasn't fear, it was a feeling. A weight pressing down on my shoulders and keeping me frozen. The shadow knew I was about to try. "Go ahead," a voice said. It was low and smooth, with an undercurrent of something inhuman, like nails scraping glass beneath the words. "Turn the key." The woman whimpered, her hands flying to her ears. "Don't listen," she hissed. "He's trying to break you." I closed my eyes tightly, trying to shut out the sound, but it was everywhere. The voice didn't seem to come from behind me, it was inside me, curling around my thoughts like smoke. "You're tired, aren't you?" it said, its tone almost soothing now. "You've been driving for so long. Your arms are heavy. Your eyes are burning. Just turn around. It'll be easier." My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and I had to fight the urge to obey. The temptation was insidious, growing stronger with each second. But I knew what would happen if I turned around. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. "You're not real," I muttered through gritted teeth. You're just some kind of trick." The voice chuckled, a deep, guttural sound that made my stomach churn. "You don't believe that," it said, almost gently. "You saw me. You've been seeing me all night, and now I'm here." "Shut up," I snapped, my voice cracking. I gripped the wheel tighter, forcing my gaze to stay locked on the dark road ahead. But it didn't help. I could feel its presence growing stronger, more solid, as though it was feeding off my fear. The woman suddenly leaned forward, her voice trembling as she whispered, "There's one way to make him leave." What I demanded, glancing at her. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with terror, but there was a strange kind of resolve in her expression. "You have to give him what he wants," she said, her voice breaking. "But he doesn't just want you to look. He wants you to stop fighting, to give up." The shadow shifted again, its presence rippling through the air like a wave. The voice grew sharper, angrier. "She's lying," it growled. "She doesn't know what I want." The woman shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "He wants you to believe that. Don't listen to him." "Why should I trust you?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You dragged me into this. I don't even know who you are." The car shuddered again, the shadows mass pressing against the back of my seat, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. "She brought you to me," the voice said, mocking now. "She's cracked. Broken. She knew what would happen when you picked her up. Ask her why she doesn't get out." My blood ran cold. I turned to her, and she flinched under my gaze, her lips trembling. "I can't," she whispered. "If I get out, he'll take me." Anger flared in my chest, hot and sharp, cutting through the fear. "So you decided to drag me into this instead?" "I didn't mean to," she sobbed. "I didn't think I didn't know he'd latch onto you too. I thought I could outrun him. I thought." "You thought wrong," I shouted, my voice shaking with rage. "And now we're both." The voice cut me off, loud and booming, filling the car like a thunderclap. "Enough." The air seemed to thicken, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, and my hands slipped from the wheel as an unbearable weight settled over me. The voice softened again, almost tender. "You don't need to fight anymore," it said. "Just look at me. It'll all be over." The woman's screams tore through the fog in my mind, breaking the spell. "Don't do it," she cried. "Don't let him in." My hand moved on its own, reaching for the mirror. I could feel its pull, magnetic and irresistible, drawing my gaze upward. I clenched my jaw, fighting against the compulsion. But it was so strong. My muscles ached, my head throbbed, and the whispering voice coiled tighter around my thoughts. Then I remembered the key. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned away from the mirror and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the car jerked forward. The voice screamed, a deafening roar of rage and pain, and the shadow writhed violently in the back seat, its form distorting and flickering like a dying flame. "Drive," the woman screamed, clutching the seatbelt as the car surged forward. "Don't stop. Don't stop until he's gone." I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the tires screeching as the car hurtled down the endless road. The shadow thrashed wildly, its edges unraveling like smoke in a storm, and the voice grew weaker, fainter, until it was nothing more than a whisper. And then, just like that, it was gone. The weight lifted, the air cleared, and the car felt lighter, as though it had been freed from some invisible force. The woman let out a shuddering sob, collapsing against the seat. I didn't slow down, not for miles, not until the road finally ended in the faint glow of a streetlight. When I stopped, I turned to her, my hands still trembling. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She didn't answer. She just unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out into the light. I watched her go, my heart pounding, and it wasn't until she was gone that I realized something was wrong. Her seatbelt was still buckled. And when I looked in the mirror, her reflection was sitting in the back seat, staring at me with empty, hollow eyes. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the mirror. Her reflection sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her head slightly tilted like she was waiting for me to speak. But the seat was empty. I twisted in my seat, my pulse pounding in my ears. The back seat was empty, nothing but the faint outline of where she'd been sitting. Yet, in the mirror, she was there solid, unmoving, and impossibly present. "What? What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, trembling with the weight of my terror. Her reflection didn't move, but I felt something, a subtle shift, a vibration in the air that made my skin crawl. Her mouth didn't open, but I heard her voice, clear and cold, inside my head. "You let him in?" "No," I whispered, shaking my head violently. I didn't look. I didn't stop. Her eyes in the mirror locked onto mine, unblinking and empty. "You didn't stop him. You brought him closer." My stomach churned. I felt the weight of her words pressing down on me like a vise, squeezing out every ounce of air in my lungs. "I drove, just like you said," I stammered. "I didn't stop. He's gone." Her expression didn't change, but her voice was colder now, sharper, each word a dagger in my mind. "You think he's gone because you can't see him. He's never gone." A shiver ran down my spine, and I turned my gaze back to the road ahead. The glow of the streetlight was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't remember driving into the shadow again, but the light had vanished, and the road stretched out endlessly once more. The car's interior felt colder now, colder than it had ever been, and I could feel the weight of something sitting just behind me. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white, and forced myself to keep my eyes forward. But then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, behind her reflection, the shadow was back. Only this time, it wasn't vague or shapeless. It had a face. A distorted, grotesque face, its features twisting like melted wax, its eyes burning holes into mine through the glass. I screamed, slamming my fist against the dashboard, trying to break free from its pull. The car shuddered, the engine sputtering, and for a horrifying moment, I thought it was going to die. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but the car didn't respond. It was like it was trapped, caught in some invisible grip. The woman's voice echoed in my mind again, louder this time, almost mocking. "You can't outrun him. You can't escape." "Why?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What does he want from me?" Her reflection tilted its head further, her empty eyes boring into mine. "Everything." The shadow began to move, its form shifting and stretching, filling the mirror, spilling out of its edges. The edges of the glass began to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading outward like ice across a frozen lake. And then I heard the voice again, not hers, not mine, but his. "You were always going to stop." It wasn't a growl this time. It was calm, almost kind. but it carried a weight that made my entire body ache. The air around me thickened, pressing against my chest, and I felt something cold brush against my neck. I flinched, jerking the wheel, but the car didn't move. It was frozen, the engine humming uselessly as the world around me darkened. I couldn't take it anymore. My resolve snapped like a brittle thread, and I turned around. The back seat was empty, but the air was alive with something unseen, something I could feel but not see, pressing against the edges of my mind. My pulse thundered in my ears as I faced forward again. The mirror was shattered now, the cracks forming a jagged, web-like pattern across the glass. But her reflection was still there, impossibly whole, staring at me through the fragments. "You shouldn't have looked," she said, her voice soft, almost pitying. And then, as I watched, her reflection began to change. Her features blurred, her form twisting and contorting until it wasn't her anymore. It was him. The shadow had taken her place, its burning eyes fixed on mine, its lips curling into a smile that wasn't human. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The car lurched forward suddenly, the engine roaring to life on its own, and the world outside the windshield dissolved into chaos. Shapes blurred and twisted, the road disappearing entirely as the darkness swallowed everything. I gripped the wheel, trying to steer, but it was no use. I wasn't in control anymore. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the mirror shattering completely, the shards falling like snow around me. And in the reflection of every fragment, his face stared back, smiling.